Turn it off. I've now done my job. So just to kick things off a little bit, one of the things that I thought is interesting to talk about is, especially now more than ever, we want to be very careful about this idea of categorizing and stereotyping and grouping. And what we have found more than anything is that while, yes, there are some trends and topics that tend to be true about people born in a certain era, and Mike's going to talk about not only what those are, but where they come from and some of the thought process of why that's true. At the same time, a lot of what we're going to talk about applies to everybody in the workforce. And I think that what we're finding more than anything is that while this particular segment of the population maybe is better at articulating that and talking about it and expressing that, it's typically true of just about everybody in the workforce. And a lot of the themes and ideas that we're going to present really do resonate with most employees, if not all employees. And I think that's an important thing, because we were talking about briefly during the last tour we just gave, one of the challenges of being an employer these days isn't just trying to manage to and cater to millennials. It's how do you do that when you also have Gen Y and baby boomers and whatever this new generation they're calling is in this business at the same time. And trying to be a little bit of everything to everybody can sometimes at times be exhausting. I know from my perspective it can even feel a little schizophrenic, just trying to mirror and be everything to everybody all at the same time. And so hopefully today, we're not going to solve that problem for you, but the goal is that maybe we can give you a little bit of guidance, a little bit of tip, just some ideas and best practices that maybe you can implement. But one thing that I would really iterate and reinforce is, at the end of the day, you have to make this your own. Each business is different. Each business has its own culture, its own style, its own employee profile, its own values. And if you try to just mirror somebody else's and enforce other people's best practices and ideas, you're going to find that it's not nearly as effective. So what we're hoping to do is inspire you to develop and think about how does this make sense from my organization or the organization that I work at, and how does this fit into what we do and who we are and how we think and operate. So that's kind of the goal of today. Before I officially hand over to Mike, I just want to share a couple thoughts with you. So young people are high-minded because they have not yet been humbled by life, nor have they experienced the force of circumstances. They think they know everything and are always quite sure about it. Sounds like millennials, right? So that was Aristotle in the 4th century. And I think what I love about this quote, and I have one other one I'll share with you, is it just shows that this isn't some new phenomenon. I think we love to talk about everything as being the first time. The reality is that this has been going on since the 4th century, and my guess is probably before that. So we'll show you one more. The children now love luxury, they have bad manners, contempt for authority, they show disrespect for elders, and love chatter in place of exercise. And if we replace chatter with text, it would be even more relevant. And that was Socrates in the 5th century. So this has been going on for a long time. This isn't new. I think it's it's an age-old challenge of the different generations mixing. They have different perspectives. They have different experiences. And that creates maturity. And that maturity influences how we think and how we act and how we behave. And when we have different levels of maturity all trying to work together, we have a challenge. Anybody with kids has probably seen that. The older kids, the younger kids don't get along so well. Not all the time anyway. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Michael Klein.
Thanks, Kelsey. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm going to steal your podium a little bit.
Yes, please
for leaning purposes. So, quick show of hands, those of you that are here because you really just mostly want to just maximize your workforce. You think millennials are the best thing since sliced bread, and you really just want to do the best that you can to make them incredibly overachievers. Show of hands, that's why you're here? Okay, show of hands, those of you that are here because you've got maybe some frustrations and some confusion and some trepidation about kind of how to work with millennials in your organization. Maybe show of hands for that? Oh, all right. So now I'm wondering why you're here. So now I'm going to put you on the spot. So a couple of people who haven't raised your hands, and I know who you are, share with me what brought you here today. Because I'd love to have this be a bit of a dialogue. I've got content and I'll present it, but yeah, please.
I am a millennial.
Oh, I forgot that category. Sorry.
Okay, listen, all right here, listening, ears open. I'll see name tags.
I forgot that category. Those of you that are millennials that are here to say, come on, people, enough of the millennial nonsense and stereotyping here. I'm here to defend millennials, right? So, yes, please, thanks.
I work with Greenfield Community College
college, so we're preparing students for the workforce, and those students are of all ages.
Okay, so understanding them and being able to prepare them as best, or enhance your ability to prepare them.
Exactly, and how they're being received by the workforce as well, and their understanding of their skill sets and their...
Great. So almost how to predict what they're going to be, or you probably know, but how to enhance your prediction of what they're going to encounter.
Right, and find common language and common ground.
That's great. That's excellent. Thank you for being here. Yeah, all of you. But anybody else? One more. Jim, 2 more, 3 more. Yeah.
I'm a coach, and some of the people that I coach are newly entering the career, and doing career coaching with them, so understanding how millennials mix into the workforce, getting a little bit more insight into that. And I also coach people who are business leaders who might be working with the millennial workforce, so just getting some more context for that.
Thank you. A little continuing ed.
Yes.
Glad you're here. Thank you. Couple more. Yeah, please.
I'm considered a millennial, but I think I'm on the cusp, and I manage 2 millennials that
Okay.
are younger than me. So I'm just here for advice.
Great. Thank you.
I think I also fall into the millennial category, if I'm not mistaken. But I've been tasked, I work for a law firm, and I've been tasked with all of the onboarding and retention. And it's a lot of entry-level positions that we are kind of constantly hiring for. So
Yeah.
by default, that's, the candidates are generally newly out of college. And,
Yeah. So you're bringing them in, you're working with them constantly, and the more you can do to understand them, the better prepared you are. Great.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? One last comment. This time I do mean it. One last comment. I hate saying no to raised hands. Anybody else? Okay. So, do we know actually, I don't remember if it's in our slides, but you tend to know these kinds of things, the dates that millennials are, the birth date that millennials
There's a
are?
lot of variation. I think the most common accepted thing is it's somewhere around 1984, 1985. So kind of really early 80s, we'll just say, is when the millennial generation starts. There's some debate about that. I've seen things that say 87. I'm 85, so I'm always like, hey, can we be on the other side of that coin? And then other days I want to embrace it, so it goes back and forth.
Okay.
But I think it's right around that edge.
Okay, great. And then, this next gen coming to the workforce, we don't have a name for it yet, right? Do we?
I think I've heard, I just recently heard somebody call it digital generation. Well,
iGen or ZGen.
iGen, ZGen.
Oh, wow.
You'd think we would pick a name by now, but
Zen.
They're non-committal.
Would you like to come up here? That was fantastic, thank you. Right, so and this has gotten pretty old at this point, but I'm going to put up here what Delcy mentioned this, what the stereotypes are about this millennial generation that I think, I don't want to get ahead of myself. They're lazy, right? They don't really want to work. They come in and they kind of expect to be vice presidents by week 2, right? They don't expect to put in their time and their effort. They're impatient, right? So again, they don't want to put in the time. They're not willing to do what it takes to kind of get ahead, but kind of have this expectation of, I need it now, where is it, give it to me. And they're whining. They're not going to get it. They're just going to kind of complain about it and say, why not? Why aren't I getting it? And I deserve it. And if they're not demanding, they're going to complain about it and whine about it, right? And finally, kind of self-absorbed. So I love Delcy's quotes earlier on, but the fact is, often this is the case of a current kind of generation in power, right? Looking at the next generation. These are not that far off from what we've seen time and time again, looking at the next generation coming in. I doubt the folks before the baby boomers said, man, these kids, they are just hardworking, ready to go, they will do whatever it takes, they are the best generation. I doubt that was the perception of them when they were 20, 21, 22 years old. So this had relevance 2 years ago when we put this in, but I'm not sure exactly what to make of it at this point, so we'll just leave that as it is. Insert your own joke at this point, really. But it really is, as Delcy was saying, kind of a flawed consensus here, this idea that millennials are somehow qualitatively different than every generation that has come before them, that they're wired differently. It's really preposterous, and some of the reasons are it's based on unscientific studies. We've got consultants who do make a lot of money, and major consulting firms going out there talking about it, and you've probably seen this, right, in all the books that are out there about understanding millennials, and here's what you need to do differently with millennials, and we've got programs to help you with your millennials, and we'll charge you a lot of money to help you understand how millennials are so fundamentally different and how you need to adjust. Well, you know the punchline here already, which is they're not that fundamentally different than the rest of us. They may look a little different, they may show themselves a little differently in the workplace, but ultimately millennials are looking for the same things that all of us are looking for in the workplace. That's what you're going to hear throughout our presentation today. Like we said earlier, you know, this is an experience that generations in power often experience of the next generation. There's really not a whole lot that's new there. There's more of a spotlight on it, I think, and there are more vehicles to kind of shine a spotlight on that, right? Social media, whatnot, that we didn't have a generation ago to kind of talk about these differences. But the differences are not fundamental. But some do exist. And this is where I'm going to invite Delcy back in. One of my joys is, I don't get to do it enough, is to co-present with Delcy, because every time I've done a presentation with her, people say, oh, I'll get feedback that was an amazing presentation, I learned so much, and it's always so much higher than the level of feedback I get when I present on my own. I'm like, well, let's see, what was the variable there, really? So it's a joy for me to present with Delcy, but I will turn back to Delcy and ask for input here, because we know that some differences do exist in terms of what millennials were raised in and the environment that they were raised in, and there have been cultural changes, right, since 1980. So what's the impact of modern parenting? Well, what do we mean by modern parenting? Anybody want to chime in on that one?
More involved, helicopter.
More involved, right? Helicopter parenting. I've heard the term. Have you heard this one? Is it snowplow or bulldoze parenting?
No, lawnmower parents.
What is it?
Lawnmower.
I haven't heard lawnmower parents, but
Yeah.
same concept, right? You're
Yeah.
clearing things away.
Yeah.
You're not just monitoring, but you're actually clearing the path for your children to do well. So you're taking away obstacles from them. You're not just making sure that they're doing well. You're actually pushing obstacles away. Anything else on modern parenting? What else do we say?
To millennial parenting, because I'm not parenting millennials, I'm parenting non-committals. I think that my style is to give them more choice than I felt like I had as a kid. So just letting them know about possibility and choices that they get to make towards those possibilities, as opposed to more structured or even helicopter or lawnmower.
Yep. Possibilities, options. Yeah, please.
Women in the workplace, more women being in the workplace,
Huh,
more
okay.
than it used to be more like just the dad would go to work and the mom would stay home.
Yep. I've been rewatching Mad Men on Netflix. What a great, horrible show to watch for just that reason. So, anybody else? Anything else on modern parenting that you feel like you've seen or you feel like might contribute to some of this millennial stuff?
I feel like my generation, we raised our children with fear. We were afraid of what was happening with our children. You know, kid on the milk carton,
Yeah.
you know, that sort of thing. I think we were afraid for our children.
Yeah. So, being extra protective, right? Keeping them close to home, not letting them go out and...
They're not riding their bikes.
I was just going to say, right.
It's really sad. I regret that.
Yeah, there's many states that even passed laws to enforce what you're talking about and made it impossible for parents to leave their kids at home or let them ride to
Let them go to the
school.
park.
And now we're starting to see that change. Oregon passed a law that actually makes it legal so that parents cannot get in trouble for letting their kids bike to school. Because we've gone too far down that spectrum, and now we're going to come back, and so the laws have to help us, and so a lot of that. I think another one that at least I've heard and certainly experienced to an extent is, I think there was a generation that if they screwed up in school, the parents blamed the kid. There's this other generation where the kid screwed up in school, they blame the parent, and they blame the teacher, or they blame the principal, or they blame the school. And there's a lot of parents calling teachers and interjecting and intervening. And I think some of that we've made up in our heads to be maybe more exaggerated than it was. I'm sure it happened before, and I'm sure it doesn't always happen now. But that is an effect where students, and I can experience this as an employer, coming in and not having faced a lot of accepting fault and accepting blame and being willing to say, you're right, I screwed up, I could have done better here, instead of saying, well, yeah, that happened, but it's because of this, and making all these excuses that are very external. And kind of that ability to self-reflect and own and understand their own shortcomings and then work to overcome those, I think is something that parents maybe disadvantaged a generation because of that kind of approach of style.
Please, yeah.
I'm, like I said, one of the older millennials, born in the early 80s, and a lot of my peers were latchkey kids and also didn't have a lot of role models in our life. We were just kind of like, go to school that's it. Like, our parents weren't really involved in our development as much. That's what I experienced, and a lot of my friends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Thank
Yeah.
you. Please, yeah.
I think there's also this constant contact with kids now, where like they're on their phone, like you need to get in contact with them, you can contact them right away, all the time,
It's true.
constantly.
You even track
When
them.
I was a kid, they used to drop me off at like an amusement park and I'd just run around all day. And my parents would say, meet me at the end of the day at 6 o'clock at this place. Now it's like every 15 minutes, are you there? How are you doing? Where are you?
It's so
Yeah.
funny. We sent our older son, to like a 2-week outward bound kind of experience this past summer, and it was no phones for 2 weeks. And he dealt with it. Once we told him like a day before. We won't be able to do it. But for us, it was like, oh my God, we're not going to be able to get in touch with him or know what's going on. And it was a little terrifying. Got used to it though, pretty damn quickly. It was not so bad. I saw some other hands. Yeah, please.
I think that constant contact is something that we see in the office too. Employees pulling their phones out to check on what their child is texting them in the middle of the day and all day.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a difficulty.
So just that constant contact with family members in
Right.
general, right? Yeah, thank you. Was there somebody else?
one more,
Oh, I'm
yeah.
sorry, I didn't see. Yeah.
I was just gonna say rewards. I mean, like, I think of my daughter, and she was awful at soccer, and she did not try, and she did not want to go to practice,
Yeah.
but she still got a trophy.
Yeah.
I was like, do you think you really deserve that trophy?
Yeah.
Because you didn't, you went into like 2 games and 1 practice, and you complained the whole time, you picked flowers. So I think just, they get rewarded for absolutely everything.
Well, yeah, then there's an expectation.
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
I've caught myself, or my kids have caught me, when I will tell them, oh, it's great that you did that, and he's like, I had to do it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, that's kind of true, you did have to
Good
do
job.
it. So,
You finished your homework, so I
participation,
had to,
right,
yeah.
it's true. I mean, in some ways, what's great to see is that there's this belief that, we understand so much through scientific research that if we only applied a portion of it, humanity would be so much further along. We've applied some of what we know in psychology about parenting. The problem is, I think, there's a pressure now on parents to be all-in-one, to be therapists for their children, to really pull out so much of who their kids are, and the expectation that you will have that kind of attention from somebody, I think, does come into the workforce. So as a new employee, you kind of expect, and I hear this story over and over, and I've seen it over and over again, expecting more out of their manager than maybe managers are willing to give in terms of time, attention, effort, focus on development. That's just the expectation now. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it really is a major change, I think, that we've seen with the next generation. So, and another story that I was reminded of, this idea of, and you mentioned Oregon, but not letting kids venture out. Do you remember the story that was so, I may be dating myself at this point, I don't remember how old it is, but parents or a family in New York City who let their 13-year-old ride the subway by themselves. It was so controversial. Oh my God, how can you let your 13-year-old out on their own? I mean, it just goes to show how far the pendulum has really swung. Yeah, please.
I have another story in a similar vein. A parent in, I think it was Washington, was arrested for, it was reckless endangerment or child neglect or something.
Yeah.
For letting her kid walk to school. Because apparently the roadway was highly trafficked and it was too dangerous for the kid to walk to school. But I actually have another one to add to modern parenting. The pressure for parents to not be parents. For them to be anything but parents. Friends, primarily.
So kind of anti-authoritative model, or anything about exerting authority is a problem, right?
And I've noticed that employees come in almost, I don't know if I'd call it a lack of respect for authority, but I see a lot of inappropriate behavior with management, like they're too comfortable with management and they just are interacting as though that supervisor, that CEO, that director of operations is their friend.
Yeah.
And I don't know if maybe that comes from just the way they were brought up and they had a relationship similar to that with their parents.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting, and let me go through a few more bullets here, but I think the question for all of us is, so, okay, we can acknowledge that, I mean, and you heard plenty of examples, these changes, and this is what modern parenting is. So how does it affect how folks are coming to the workforce, and what is reasonable for us to be able to do in organizations to kind of adjust to that, not only to recruit them, but to reward them and retain them? Because yes, to some extent, they're going to spend their 20s understanding the real world, but if we also want to retain them as employees and develop them and grow them, we need to make some adjustments and really have an understanding of, well, what it is that what are they expecting when they walk in the organization, and how do we at least, if not buy into some of the things that we think might be flawed in people's backgrounds these days, how do we at least give them what we think they're expecting? Does that make sense? Okay. Downsizing or right-sizing? So millennials are, and this also feels a little old to me at this point as well, but very few people have the same employer from college till retirement anymore, right? Not that there is a thing called retirement anymore, but there's not cradle to grave caretaking of employees, and that really used to be the psychological contract, right? And now I think really used to large organizations, small and mid-sized organizations deciding that, well, we need to right size, we need to really fundamentally, we need to remove major pieces of our organization to be more lean, to be able to be more agile. And so millennials are coming in thinking, well, I'm not going to be here forever. My parents were not anywhere forever, and so what have you done for me lately? Because I don't have an expectation, as our parents did, that a job is going to be a job for 20, 30, or 40 years. I don't know if any of you have this experience, but I'm almost shocked when I see emails or notifications on LinkedIn celebrating 30 years at this company. I'm like, really? People still do that? That's amazing. Millennials are not growing up with that sense that they're going to find that one company, or even that one career necessarily, right, and stick to it. So they're thinking about growth, movement, and change.
So there's an interesting point there is I just saw, just in the last couple of weeks, again, unscientific study, so take it for its worth, but some data that was saying this next generation coming in after millennials have flip-flopped back, and what they want is long-term stability. They're starting to ask questions about pensions and 401ks. I think they've been impacted by the chaos that is created from constant change. I think we all are. And this newest generation coming in, not to change topics, is actually, there's data that supports they're craving stability. And that they would rather say, hey, can I be here for 15 years? Because I don't really want to go through the chaos and the change. I've got too much change in my life. So that for some of us who are challenged with that on millennials, I know that we are, there's maybe some hope that the next generation may have a slightly different approach to how they think about employment and longevity. So I think, again, it's that pendulum just swinging back and forth. And one of the things that I heard about modern parenting is, the best thing I ever heard that made the most sense to me was somebody said, the reason that the parents parented the way they did was they overcompensated for what they didn't have as children. So each generation overcompensates for what they didn't have, and so that just keeps this pendulum swinging back and forth, because you're just going to keep then going to the other extreme. I think that's why we see these fluctuations that do exist. While they are stereotypes, there is some truth to them.
Quick pitch for Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, the Jerry Seinfeld series. In an interview with Alec Baldwin, they were talking about childhood. And I forget who it was it Alec or Jerry, who said, their theory was that their parents didn't really have a childhood. That their generation, boomers, kind of were the first generation to have a childhood. And then boomers said, now we're going to perfect it. We're really going to maximize this childhood thing. And that goes back to the modern parenting stuff. And now we're seeing, again, the pendulum, like Delsey's saying, swinging back the other way, which is that, okay, maybe we've gone a little too, I don't want to say child-centric, because it sounds wrong to not be child-centric, but perhaps child-centric, so.
That's because you're of that generation.
That's right, that's right, that's my bias. So the new contract is not, we're going to keep you here forever, although like Delsey said, there's some data trending the other way, but the contract is, you're going to come here, we're going to reward you, we're going to try to keep you, we're going to develop you, but we don't necessarily expect you to stay. And they're coming in not thinking that they're going to be here forever. So then as a result, well, what are their needs? And so much of what you're going to see on this next slide, I think you're going to say, well, isn't that, like Delsey was saying, isn't that just everybody? Isn't that kind of what we're all looking for? It's a matter of, I think, how you present it to millennials, how you draw them in by the way you present it, and then how you retain them by talking about it. So certainly respect and engagement. I think we heard loud and clear that that's what this generation received growing up, right? Parents who are attentive. Again, back to, it might not have been comedians in cars, it might have been somewhere else, but this idea of being at school. I don't think my parents spent a day in my school. I mean, I know they went to parent-teacher conferences, maybe once a semester, but there was very little actual involvement in school in the day-to-day, and that's completely changed with the generation in the workforce now. I mean, their parents were very involved, to the point of perhaps overscheduling their after-school activities. That's a separate topic for another day, maybe, but it's certainly relevant. So they're expecting that kind of respect, open-ended conversations, that kind of engagement about where do you want to go, what do you want to do, what are you passionate about. It's not just come into your job and your reward is your paycheck. And I think we know that people in general perform better when there's much more than that to their work, but even more so, I think this generation is expecting that. Anything you want to add to, you need to go ahead, to the respect and engagement piece?
No, and I think, and I'll talk about this a little bit in a second, but I think really the engagement, to your point, is about engaging them in the work of the company, not just their specific job. So what do we do? What is the impact? And I think a lot of us have experienced that has to go beyond just directly serving our customers. A lot of that has to be, what do we do in the charity, from a charitable perspective? We'll get, during job interviews, first round, candidates trying to get a job here asking us, how much money do you guys donate to charity, or what charities do you get involved in, or what will my opportunities be to be involved in helping the community? And so it is more than just a job. It is part of their identity. Their work is part of their identity. And so they want that identity to be rich. They don't want it to be very specific and granular. And the more that you can engage on that, there's actually a lot of reward and a lot of potential for the business. It's not just a kind of a give mentality. There's a give and a get mentality if you can embrace it and partner it. And this is where you really have to adapt it to your organization. How do we engage in a way that helps the organization, that helps the employees, that helps our community, but it all works? And that's where you can't just steal somebody else's idea. You really have to develop and create your own engagement for your identity. And again, we'll talk a little more about that.
Comments on that or reactions to any of that? This idea of wanting perhaps more respect and engagement than prior generations? Please.
I can speak to that probably being right, at least for me. I work for a nonprofit and I don't work there for the paycheck. But I'll get people, primarily family members, they're like, you've been there for a while and you're not exactly making a lot of money. Why haven't you left yet? Do something better. Do something different. And it's like, you didn't get it.
Yeah.
Others?
I have the benefit of working for a human services organization, and clearly no money in this.
Right.
But everyone that I interview, I'm a recruiter, everyone I interview is in it for the mission. And
Yeah.
that's just bottom line.
The connection to something larger than themselves. And again, I mean, I think that comes back to this idea of a changed psychological contract that, I don't know what's going to happen to this company because I saw my parents get downsized or right-sized, and so I need to get something that connects to me in a deeper way because I know next week or next month these jobs might be eliminated or changed. So it's important for me to feel connected to the mission of the company.
I think that's part of it, and I think also if you think about it from kind of the Maslow's triangle perspective, I think they're entering the workforce with more of their buckets filled, and so they're almost, now their hunger is for the next level, whereas previous generations, they needed the money. They were living paycheck. Their parents weren't supporting them and paying the rent and helping them with their insurance. They needed that job, and I think now that more of those needs have been fulfilled, they're now eager for the next level of kind of what do I want from life. And I think that wouldn't be true if they were all starving and hungry. I mean, it's just reality is, I think part of it is a lot of these generation coming in are in okay shape, and so now they're hungry for something more.
I think in healthcare, it's a very different perspective. We have a lot of non-professional employees who make more than 15 an hour, but not a lot more. They're front-end staff, they have or medical assistants, they have no education. They come in with a minimum amount of experience usually. A lot of them are single moms, divorced moms, they have childcare issues that we have to deal with. It's very different from what you're portraying in a professional track.
Yep. And my guess is, and this is a total assumption, so correct me if I'm wrong, please, but my guess is they're probably more focused on the work and the job and maybe not asking as many questions about how does this organization volunteer in the community. And I think it's the exact thing, is if, and this is where it isn't just generational, part of it is life circumstance.
Right.
Generically speaking, we can say millennials tend to be in a better life circumstance, but you're right, if you're not there yet, you're still hyper-focused on, I need to keep this job, I need to do everything I can to earn this job, and how do I get a promotion? Not so much, what's our philanthropic philosophy?
I hate to say this coming from a university, but more and more employers are not requiring bachelor's degrees or other particular education to be required, even really large companies. And so that's why I think also what millennials find important, and probably the future workforce as well, will be some things like professional certificates or just upskilling them and giving them the professional development that they need. And because then it also lets them know that they feel really valued within the organization, and then it also will help to find the company culture going forward.
Thanks. So let's talk about clarity of roles and responsibilities. Again, something that I think every employee of any organization needs and wants. I do a lot of work with family-owned businesses, and not just, teeny tiny family-owned businesses, but $8 to $15 million a year businesses, and you'd be amazed at the lack of clarity around who does what and when. So again, everybody in the workforce wants to know. I mean, think of your jobs that you've had where you've been satisfied or unsatisfied or frustrated when there hasn't been clarity about, okay, so what am I supposed to accomplish? What are my goals? It might be vastly different than is what is written in my job description. It tends to be very different, or what's even reviewed in my performance appraisal every year. For millennials, really important, and again, for everybody, really important to have some clarity around what are my goals, how am I going to grow, how am I going to develop, how am I contributing to the organization in a broader way than just my day-to-day. So, having written job descriptions always really critical, but just being honest about how clear you are with this generation about what they're supposed to accomplish and how they'll be measured. It's absolutely critical.
Yeah, I'd go one step further beyond just roles and responsibilities, and you hinted at this, but what I've really seen is it's metrics, performance criteria. It's almost like, this generation grew up, to a certain extent, on a lot of video games, a lot of dashboards, a lot of scoreboards. They watched a lot of sports, they played a lot of sports. They want to know what the score is, and they want to know, am I winning or am I losing? And they want to know constantly. And so I think it's not just having a really clear job description, which is the first piece, but then building on that, and how do I know where I'm at right now? How do I know tomorrow? Can I see if I'm headed the right direction? And I don't want to say gamifying, because I don't think that's exactly appropriate, but it's similar to the idea of, I want to be able to have a very clear understanding of if I'm doing the things you want, and I want that to be very clear so that I can do them and then ask for the raise, the promotion, the recognition, the entitlement that comes along with that. But the clearer you can make that, if you can get those metrics right, and that's why you have to be really careful, because if you get the metrics wrong and they achieve them, and it isn't the whole story, then they're very confused and very frustrated and very angry, because you said this is exactly what you wanted, I did it to the T, and now you're telling me, yeah, but there's these other things. It doesn't work. You really have to get those metrics right, and if you can keep it simple and say, these are the 4 things that matter, here's how we track and measure them. If you're doing these things really well, you're going to be doing really well. That tends to work really well. And I think, to your point, all generations would appreciate that. I have just seen a much stronger demand of that from this generation that we're talking about.
Well, I kind of chuckle when you said the annual review, because
Right.
it's a quarterly review.
Yeah, if not
For us,
weekly.
they demand it.
Yeah, there's a huge push away from the annual or even, the performance review in general towards just more timely, as-needed feedback. But to Delsey's point, I'll expand on that. I know how many steps I take in a day. I know what my sleep patterns are. The tech that's available, right, to this generation, they're used to it. They're used to being able to measure everything. And so why wouldn't, your expectation be, I need those numbers for how I'm doing and how we're doing as a company. So.
Yeah, to the annual review, we had somebody say to us once, we used a long time ago, annual reviews, and somebody said, why don't you know if I'm going to be here in a year? So that's too far away from now. And that's kind of the mentality of, they're evaluating and reevaluating their standing on a constant basis, and so an annual review, well, that's kind of irrelevant. Like, let's check in once a week, and we'll see how I'm doing, and I'll see how you're doing, and I'll let you know if I'm happy, and you'll let me know if you're happy, and we'll have a conversation about it. But it's kind of that constant feedback loop, and I'm sure you'll get into recognition and some of that.
There was a great comedian who's not around anymore, Mitch Hedberg, who said his favorite interview question was, for job interview, was, where do you see yourself in 5 years from now? And his answer was, celebrating the 5th year anniversary of this job interview. Jim, did you have something? Yeah.
Trying to think out loud because the thought's still forming, but you mentioned something and kind of cut the idea about overscheduling, kids being overscheduled. And I'm just kind of connecting that to almost the inverse of this clarity around roles and responsibilities, and having managed probably over a dozen millennials or more in the course of my management career. Like, I definitely think I've seen this hunger for variety, and I want to be involved in a lot of things, and almost not to offend any CEOs that could be in the room, that the shiny object syndrome of a CEO, of like, oh, there's this, oh, there's that. And I want to pursue ideas because maybe I've grown up taking AP Chem and taking Latin and having soccer and music and debate club and having these wide variety of interests, which are fantastic assets. But sometimes it's like, well, I want to be a project manager today, and I want to be a tech tomorrow, and I want to, in the next hour, be presenting to the company on benefits. And how that can detract from clarity.
Yes, and I wasn't planning on doing this, but I'll make a pitch for the use of psychometric instruments to measure that, because that's one of those things that I think, show of hands, those of you that use any kind of self-assessment for hiring at all, or development necessarily, where you go online and have folks, fill out a questionnaire. I'm a huge fan of those tools for so many reasons, but one of the things that you can measure is how curious is a potential employee, and how much will they be, if their score is really high, will they be distracted or engaged by lots of different kind of opportunities and things that they could do. So I think it's one of the things to kind of think about. When you're using tools like that, you can measure, okay, to what extent does this person kind of fit this mold that we're kind of presenting here, and to what extent do they not, and do they maybe just look the part, but ultimately their personality is not wired in that way. So just a quick pitch for those kinds of tools if you don't use those. Really encourage people to look into them.
Yeah, and I think that also comes back to the idea of the metrics and the more clarity, because to Jim's point, stereotypically speaking, there is this desire to experiment and explore and get involved in different things. And that's where the metrics can come in really handy, because, again, the balance, if you can say, okay, these are the metrics that matter, these are the goals, if you're obtaining this and you find yourself with more time, then you are allowed and permitted and even encouraged to experiment and try new things and do different things. And we saw this with Google when they have what's called 20% time, where an employee was told you can spend 20% of your time doing whatever you want. Well, the hidden truth there was they were working 15-hour days, so 20% still got Google more than 8 hours. But regardless, the idea is, if you can create clarity around what is expected and then provide autonomy to say above and beyond that, feel free to contribute in the ways that you are uniquely gifted and able to. And that kind of celebration of their identity and their individuality, it really goes a long way. But I think the way the employer survives that is having the clarity around, this is the expectation. If you can meet that and are able to succeed in that, then explore and experiment and contribute in other ways. And that's the balance that at least we have kind of started to experiment with, that seems to work well for both the employee and the employer. Because obviously there's got to be rails around these things. You still have to run a company. Some of us have very strict legal requirements or compliance requirements. It can't just be you show up to work and run around. There's got to be order. And so that's kind of how we've thought about that balance.
And not to beat a dead horse here, but I think, one of the ways, Delcy mentioned kind of helping folks, or helping create a space for their individuality and letting them know their uniqueness can be applied and is appreciated. These kinds of instruments that are out there are kind of a relatively inexpensive and quick way to do that, and I've found that part of my practice has grown over the years, I think because that generation is really dying for that kind of feedback. You come out of college, you have no professional experience, you don't really know where your potential is, you don't necessarily know a whole lot about kind of how you're wired, what your values and motives are. When employers can provide that kind of feedback to new employees using these tools, it can really help not only bring them into the organization, but help them see that, look, we care about your development and growth, we want to understand you in a slightly deeper way, we're going to apply some of these instruments to your development. So that's actually how we started working together way back. Was the use of some of those tools. Yeah, please.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
We use a lot of assessments and 360 assessments with my clients, and I was just curious what you use for that assessment on.
Yeah. I'll just, my caveat is, or my intro to my comment on that is, beware the consultant that says I've got one tool, because chances are they went to a 3 to 5 day certification workshop and distribute one tool. So it's kind of like, coaching. Anybody can kind of hang up a shingle and call themselves a coach. Beware people that have kind of one tool that they use. So I use a whole range of tools based on the situation. I'll give you some examples. Hogan Assessments, great company. MHS up in Toronto, they've got a whole suite of tools. I do use the Myers-Briggs folks, not for the Myers-Briggs, but for other tools. They just rebranded themselves. They used to be CPP, now they're the Myers-Briggs company, which will never flow off the tongue. But yeah, there's a whole range of tools that are great. You have to be a really informed buyer though, because assessments are not regulated, and so they can claim. I've unfortunately had clients who say, "Oh, we use this tool. What do you think about it?" I'm like, "Well, I've never heard about it. I tried to get into the studies, and I called the company and said, "Can you send me your technical manual, third-party reviews? Oh, we've got some great marketing materials."
Right.
Yeah. No.
Templated sheets or something.
Right. So.
I'd like to pick your brain after a little bit about
Sure,
assessments.
happy to.
I use one called the Entrepreneurial Mindset
Okay.
Profile, EMP 360.
Okay.
So I was just curious if I could pick your brain about
I've
it.
heard of it. I haven't looked into it much. But there is, if you are interested, let me give you this resource just to do a little digging on your own. Burroughs.org, BUROS. They're a university-affiliated center for testing. They've actually been around since the dawn of these kinds of tests, which actually I believe grew out of either World War I or World War II, testing for mental fitness, but they've gone into workplace assessments. Anyway, they're kind of a warehouse for third-party reviews of instruments. So you can go on burroughs.org and see if the instrument has ever been submitted for a third-party review. And then you can actually buy the third-party review for like $15. So great resource. I always look there first. If anybody says I've got the best
Yeah, a
tool.
whole list of assessments.
Yeah, and some people I find are really intimidated by the whole assessment industry, and so their organization doesn't go anywhere near assessments. I think that's a mistake, because I think, if you have the right tool, knowing they're not perfect, but if you've got the right tool and can use it well, they're incredibly valuable. So happy to chat with anybody about that once we're done. I didn't mean to go astray with that. So purpose and meaning, I think we've kind of hit on this a bit, right? Which is that this generation, and all of us are more so, and again, to Delsey's point, as the bottom rungs of Maslow's hierarchy are fulfilled, at the top is kind of self-actualization and purpose and meaning. And to kind of keep that in mind, that even if it's not your job as an employer to provide purpose and meaning for somebody, you can at least bring up in an interview or in your materials that you know that being connected to an organization is important, and finding fulfillment in your job is important. You have to back it up with something, but at least you can kind of address it and say you're aware of the importance of it as an organization.
Yeah, and I think a great example, just to help you visualize this, is Patagonia has really just mastered this. They're a retail clothing store. You could compare them to so many other retail clothing stores, but the demand and the number of applicants they get for their jobs, their retention, a lot of the data supports that because they're perceived as this incredibly responsible global player who's making a big difference in the world, employees flock to work there compared to in the mall, the store to the right and the store to the left. Even though the job is basically identical. You're going to show up, you're going to sell clothing, you're going to check people out, you're going to stock shelves, you're going to fold sweaters. Same job, but people really are drawn to work there. And at the end of the day, it's really good marketing. I mean, it's not their corporate responsibility, and actually what they do is not all that different than a lot of other brands, but they've done a great job of marketing themselves, of creating this image and this portrayal of us being this incredible global citizen. And by working here, you're helping to save the planet. And they have just mastered the art. So you're looking at a case study on perfection, that would be it. There's a few others that are very good, but they really have proven this point very, very effectively. And it isn't all, I don't mean to sound so cynical, it isn't all that it isn't still good, but they've just really kind of found that and figured out how to maximize it, because employment in retail is very difficult. and they found a way to really drive employment that also drives then customer base, because customers also shop there and buy there because they feel like they're supporting the global citizen. So it really transverses to both. And I think more and more that's what we're seeing is, if you think about what matters to your customers and to the global community, there's a very good chance that that also matters to your employees. And if you can marry those two things effectively, you can really, A, it's less complicated because you have one thing that you're focusing on from a marketing and branding perspective, and two, it tends to resonate really, really well, especially on the lower wage employment. So if you have a lot of retail, a lot of entry-level employment, the more that you can do that, the more likely it's going to have success and impact and engagement with your employees.
Let's pause there. What's going through your heads right now? We've kind of dumped a lot out there, talked about a lot of different things. We've got some more content to cover, but what's going through your minds in terms of your own organization, how this is relevant, is it not relevant? Are there questions that you'd like us to answer? Yeah, please.
We don't have a retention issue. We've had conversations about that. So my mind isn't about how do we keep people. It's how do we get more out of them. I feel like we don't capitalize on their abilities because we're not necessarily embracing how they want to work.
You're not embracing, sorry?
How they want to work.
Okay.
How to get the most out of them.
Right.
From a productive standpoint.
I think one of the best things, and we'll talk about this, but the easiest answer, and I think I'm sure there's a whole slide on it, is just listening. The number one thing you can do is listen to your millennials, to your workforce, and there's different ways of structuring that. You can create task force, and you can give the task force a specific objective. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. We want to further engage our employees and allow them to contribute at a higher level. And then really just proposition that question to them and say, here's what the objective is. We've gathered you because we believe that you have more that you can contribute to the organization. We really believe in your potential and your unique identity and your individuality. How do we help bring that out of you? How do we help nurture and develop that and benefit the organization? And you'd be amazed at how, in most cases, how well they're going to be able to articulate that answer for you. And you can guess and try, but a lot of times if you just sit down and ask, they'll articulate kind of how they can contribute, or at least they'll have some ideas. And then I think through iteration and experimentation, you can find how that fits into the organization. And I think the only advice I would give is just be careful you don't make the mistake of swinging the pendulum too far. And so let's try, okay, those are 5 good ideas. Let's pick the one that you guys are most passionate about, and then let's put some rails around it and try to implement that and see what the impact is. And let's agree that we're going to measure and check in on this in 90 days and see what the impact is. Because I think if you swing too far, I think what happens is then if you manage to keep that sense of what can happen when this gets out of control, under control, you don't want to take that lid off and just let it, the soda erupt out of the bottle. So I think that if you can kind of find that balance of let's try to inch the pendulum back towards where we can get more out of it, I think you can get a long way. And that we have just found, part of it is we're an employee-owned company, so we have kind of a further emphasis on engagement and input. But we do a lot of task force. Once a month we have something called an owners meeting, where it's basically just, we invite the whole company into this room, we pick a topic, and we just talk about it as a company. We let people have feedback and input. It could be our marketing strategy, it could be our compensation strategy. Some difficult, challenging topics that a lot of people don't talk to their employees about. We'll just open up the room and talk to people and get their feedback and input. And we're very clear. Just because you raise your hand and say you have an idea does not mean we're going to implement your idea, but we do want to hear it, and we want to think about it, and we're going to react to it, or we're going to respond to it, and we might even push back on you and say, yeah, I understand that perspective, but have you thought about it from this perspective, or let me help you understand it this way. And just that engagement and allowing them to have input can go a long way, and then a lot of times you can find these little ways that, maybe we could do this.
And hopefully every management team is thinking about this issue, right? How do we get the most out of people? But I found that unless you have a strategic HR person on that team, it can be really hard. And a lot of small companies just don't have the budget for having somebody kind of at that level, or even, full-time HR person in a lot of cases, right? To think about stuff, which is actually, when I came into Paragus, the work that I was doing was a lot of this kind of one-on-one advising and listening with employees that was, in part, I think it's fair to say, because you had a half-time HR person or an HR person without a whole lot of experience. And so if you don't have somebody at the strategic level HR, there are people you can bring in to kind of do some of this work and provide it to the organization. But it's a great question, so thank you for bringing it up. Others, where are your heads at? What are you thinking about in terms of your own organization? Yeah.
So I run an organization, nonprofit organization, 275 employees. And when you talk about millennials and your ideas, it applies to a very small portion of my employees. I'm a low-wage employer, like healthcare, human services, or low-wage employers, soon-to-be minimum wage employers, quite honestly, with the $15 minimum wage coming to us. And it's not so much as I've gone to these trainings about generational trainings, it's not so much about a millennial, what is a millennial. I think what impacts that, and a lot that hasn't been talked about in these trainings, is this millennial from a suburban community that's had a wealthier school system, who's been in a socioeconomic class that's a little bit higher than potentially the employees that are working at Sunshine Village. And the complications in their lives are very different. It's not, what kind of car can I buy? It's, how do I buy a car?
Right.
And so when we talk about recruitment and retention strategies for a low wage and a minimum wage workforce, whether it's for a boomer or for millennial or for anybody in between or anybody coming into our workforce, what we have to do as employers is so much different, so different than if I was just to be running, quite honestly, a bank or an insurance company.
Right.
And so when you do studies in the future, it would be interesting to see, it's not about millennials, but how is a millennial who grew up in Long Meadow different than a millennial who came from a different socioeconomic class, maybe in Holyoke or Chicopee or Springfield, who came through a gateway school where they didn't have the opportunities and the choices that somebody who did has, and so then they can come into the workforce with all their buckets filled. So this is what they want versus somebody who's just coming into the workforce because they need 3 jobs, and this job is one of them, just to survive.
Yeah, I think it's very similar to what your point earlier was, is when we're talking about millennials, maybe what we should actually be thinking about is how many rungs of the Maslow ladder have they already fulfilled. And I think traditionally, stereotypically, we talk about millennials as being higher on that ladder, but you're right, not all people born in that era are in that socioeconomic position. I think, though, that a lot of the principles, my coach runs a human service organization with about 100,000 employees, mostly entry level, mostly minimum wage, and what he's talked to me a lot about is they meet the employee where they are, and they make investments into them regardless of where they're starting from. And so, for example, and this is a theoretical example, but if your working force is more focused on how do I buy a car, can I buy a car, have that training. Say, you know what, we're going to bring in somebody who's going to talk about auto financing and whether you should lease or whether you should pay and how much down payment you should buy and how you should think about how much money you can spend on a car. They do a lot, my coach does a lot with his employees around just kind of helping them identify how do you choose the right housing situation, how do you figure out transportation, how do you balance a checkbook, how do you manage finances, how do you have a home budget, and then they start kind of from there evolving into, most of these entry-level employees end up being parents at some point. So they do a lot of parenting classes. How do you parent and work? How do you handle this? How do you engage with your children? And I think the generation, I think what you can say that is going to apply no matter where that person is at, is they do want to be invested in. What they're investing in, what you're investing in, might be different based on where that person is. But they're hungry for growth, they're hungry for recognition, they're hungry to be acknowledged, they're hungry to be treated and respected in a way that, you know, they feel honored and that you care about them. It just maybe you have to cater that to where that person is.
So to your point, it's really not, managing a workforce is incredibly complicated when you've got people at different stages of life and from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And just real quick in terms of resources, and then I do want to, I hate to ask, but if you could just hold your comments briefly, I'd want to get through the next couple of slides and then we'll have time for Q&A, I think. You may have a resource that you can already take advantage of if you have an EAP, an Employee Assistance Program. You know, those programs have really evolved over years, so they've got great, I mean, a lot of them are online resources, but I know there are like local EAPs that will come and do those workshops on how to buy a car, how to buy a house, how to do budget planning, and if you're not taking advantage of that for your staff, I'd encourage you to look into an EAP if you're already affiliated with one. So.
And I'll just add to that, I know we got to get going, but one step further than just bringing in the EAP or the external provider is your senior leadership also playing a role in that. There's something very significant about showing that the organization at the highest level cares. So whether you're actually providing that content or you're sitting in the audience or you're there serving coffee, you can't underestimate how big an impact that can have compared to just facilitating the training. Really demonstrating that the organization cares about the people that are working there and are investing in them, and not just with their dollars, but with their time and their energy and their hearts and their passion. That is universal, and that will apply to all socioeconomic statuses and states, and that will be paid back in dividends if you are able to make those types of commitments. And I think that that's a really critical lesson we've learned and I've seen in other companies.
That's a great point. That's a great point. Do the folks at the top of the organization really walk the talk, and do they care enough to show up, right? So, so these are the slides that I just wanted to throw up real quick. So what does it look like at work? Well, again, you could pull out that we're talking about millennials here, and just talk about this as best practices for organizational work, for recruiting, rewarding, and retaining your employees, which is a focus on development. This shift, like I was talking about earlier, away from annual, or we were talking about from annual performance reviews to quarterly or even weekly. I mean, how important it is to do weekly check-ins, you should know at all times. Well, a big part of those conversations really need to be, so what are you doing next? So what do you want to get better at? So yeah, where do you see yourselves, if not a year from now, a month from now? You know, what do you want to be doing differently in a month? So focused on development. Again, opportunities like Delcy was saying we were talking about for listening and for letting them share ideas, whether it's kind of town halls, whether it's one-on-ones, whatever the case may be. Of course, consistent communication goes without saying. And then I think we've also talked about this one at length, which is job and organizational purpose. You know, really, why are you here? What role are you filling? Why does it matter to the organization? And why does the organization matter? So, and then, what are the challenges to management? And this is more kind of at an individual level. So, what's hard about doing this stuff, I guess, is what this slide is about. Or what are some of the unconscious or conscious biases that we may hold that get in the way of us doing some of the things that we're talking about, that we know are going to provide for a more engaged workforce and a more satisfied workforce. And it's things like, you know, the way that we were brought up and what we were given as employees. I'll never forget that there's this horrible process in graduate school, for those who've been through graduate school, comprehensive exams, where you spend a summer, at least in the school I went to, studying for these exams. They're not really relevant to what you're studying. They don't really forward your education. It's just like a rite of passage that you have to go through. Everybody gets through it. Nobody ends up failing out of school because they failed their comps, right? They just have to get through it. I heard that my school eliminated the comprehensive exams. I'm like, how dare they? I had to suffer through that. These people need to suffer through that. So I think putting aside our own, or thinking about at least, the opportunities that we didn't get coming up in the workforce, or the ways in which we were maybe, how would you say it, not happy with our development, right? We have to, I think, be very conscious of those and know and be able to put those aside when we're offering something different, because often, if you haven't been through a whole lot of development yourself, or this kind of reflection that comes with development, you're just applying what you've learned, right? You're just taking the lessons that you learned, consciously or unconsciously, and applying it to the next generation. So I think being aware of these things is really important. More time listening. I don't have enough time to listen as it is, or do what I need to do, and you're telling me I need to listen to employees more and give them more open-ended time. Well, that's a huge barrier, right? And that's something that you need to kind of, I think, address and deal with and say, am I going to commit more time to just listening and being around my staff, like Delcy said, kind of showing up, having more time when, for the people that want it, I'm available as an executive or as a manager of this company, and they can come and kind of chat with me and talk to me, and I will listen to them. It's not my agenda to communicate what the company's doing necessarily or what I want them to do, but more for really to take a temperature check and see how folks are doing. And one of the biggest ones we haven't even touched on yet is that titles don't equal legitimacy, right? You probably experienced this, where folks will come in and say, you have to earn authority. I don't give you authority over me. I want to respect you as my manager. You need to kind of earn that from me, which is a total flip from, I think, prior generations, which is you come in, the boss is the boss is the boss. I'm sure you've all heard things that have been said to you as a manager, or that you've heard were said to managers. They're like, that's your boss you're saying that to. How could you even possibly think to say that? And I think it's this idea of, well, we're almost, even though you're my boss, we're on equal footing, or this assumption that we're on equal footing in some weird ways. And so I think thinking about earned legitimacy or earned authority is really, really important when you think about a new workforce coming in. So,
another interesting point on the titles, the opposite effect of this is, again, we're talking stereotypically here, but there was a study that was done that showed if you look at Gen X and baby boomers, they would prefer a financial compensation increase over a title increase. And then stereotypically speaking, the millennial generation would prefer the title change over the compensation if they had to pick one or the other. And so that's an interesting thing to think about in your organization of, do we ever just change titles without compensation? And do we have any way for employees to change titles? Because for a lot of millennials, that's the scoreboard. And they want to show growth and advancement. They want to feel like they're moving. And sometimes that doesn't have to mean more money. Sometimes it can just be a change in title. Adding senior to the end of a title, having different levels, those types of things can actually mean a lot because it shows growth, and a title's very external. It's on their LinkedIn page, it's on their Facebook page, it's in their company profile, it's on the website. If you don't have a website, your employees are going to ask, I want to be on the website, I want to be seen on point to things. But salary is very private. They can't announce to the world, I got a raise. I mean, some of them will. But it's just, think about that at titles and thinking about how we think about titles differently in an organization. We added a lot of titles recently so that we have more ladders and more ways to move people around and change things, where it isn't just, you are this role, and we're going to hire you, and you're probably going to retire with that same job title. Your salary could change 15 times, but it's in the same title. That doesn't work as much, because 15 years without changing a title feels like stagnation.
It's amazing how many 28-year-old vice presidents there are, isn't there? That to me is but anyway, there was a comment, yeah.
I just want to quickly say, so before I was just business development associate in my position, and it was in my email signature line, and for me at work, I have to reach out to CEOs. I need to get in front of the decision makers of a company. I often was treated differently, so they gave me a raise. They also gave me a title change, and the response rate increased so much just from seeing director of business development versus business development associate. So I just thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, it's got real concrete results attached to it. Great.
So we are almost at time. We're going to wrap up so you guys can get back to your managing of millennials. But just a couple of, kind of to recap and put a point on this, I think we've talked about this a lot. Purpose matters a lot. Really thinking about your organization's purpose. And if the organic purpose of your organization itself doesn't make sense, think about, can you create a purpose? For us, we recently have really started focusing on animals. And so a lot of the work that we do, a lot of the money that we give, a lot of our volunteering is about supporting animals. We give a lot of animal shelters, we do a lot of volunteering there. And it has nothing to do with IT, but that's the passion that our staff had, so we embrace that, and we're putting focus on that. So that you can create a purpose. It doesn't have to be organic. Values, we didn't spend a lot of time on this today, and I'm happy to talk about it. I think we'll end up probably doing a whole presentation someday just about corporations' values. But having really strong values that you enforce and they're actually used every single day, they're not just up on the lobby wall and somebody wrote them 15 years ago and we don't even talk about them, and if I asked you, you couldn't recite them. Anybody who goes on a tour, you can ask any of our staff to recite our 5 core values, and if they can't, you can just walk them out the door with you. We reinforce our values so constantly. They're so ingrained in our culture. That really can go a long way. And again, we can talk about that more another day. Transparency. I think this is something that can be a little uncomfortable for organizations, but it's really, really important. The most important part of transparency is the why. If you make a decision, if you announce something, if you decide something, you have to explain why. It's no longer okay just to say, because I said so. That doesn't really work that well in parenting, but it really doesn't work with millennials. So keep that in mind. We at Paragus have something called the weekly address, which is every single week I record a video to the staff that ranges from 5 minutes to 40 minutes, depending on the week, that talks about what's going on in the company, what decisions are being made, why those decisions are made, what events are happening. That level of transparency is the kind of thing that millennials crave. And I'm not encouraging you all to go down that road, because once you do it, it's really hard to undo it. That's 3 hours of my weekend I'll never get back. But it's making sure that you're explaining why and talking about things. You know, we're an open book company, which means all of our finances are public to our employees. Those types of things, and you don't have to do everything. Again, you have to adjust this for your organization and what makes sense for you, but finding ways to be more transparent can go a long way. And then finally, we talked about this a lot, input. Really asking for input, allowing for input, creating formats for input. And you know, Mike made a great point about making yourself available. We have a program called Beans with Bean where any employee can request through my executive assistant to have an hour with me at the coffee shop across the street, and I reserve every Monday from 4 to 5 to do that. I would say half of the time, that time slot doesn't get used. And so just because you make yourself available doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to take it every time and consume your time, but knowing that it's an option can have a really strong impact. So sometimes it's just the willingness to be available, even if you don't actually have to commit to that time every single time. But having that open door policy, meaning it, and creating structured ways, whether they're office hours or coffee hours or hanging out in the lounge, your lunchroom, your break room, those can go a really long way of just making sure people know that you're approachable. They might not take advantage of it. Some people won't. Many people won't. But just knowing that they could if they needed to can really have an impact. And then finally, opportunity. So opportunity for learning, opportunity for growth, opportunity for development, all of the things that we've talked about, they're on a journey and a path, and I think a lot of us are, and we all are trying to gain new experiences and process new things and learn new things. Anything you can do to create those opportunities, they can be directly aligned to the work that you're doing, they can be separate from the work that you're doing. We've brought in trainers to talk about, like life coaches talking about how to manage your personal life and how to kind of have more purpose in your life. Nothing to do with what we do, but it's an investment that we're making in our employees that shows, hey, we want to support you and invest in you. And again, each organization has to develop this for themselves and make it meaningful for their employees. And I think to your point earlier, meeting them where they are and what's relevant, because bringing in something that's over their head is going to seem very out of touch and is probably going to backfire and make you look not so connected. So really allowing them to have input and feedback. What would you like to be trained on? What are your biggest challenges in life? Whenever we hire a new employee, I take them out and I just interview them, and one of the questions I ask is, what are your personal goals? What are your professional goals? And what are your bucket list items? So for every single person who's worked here and who has ever worked here, I have a notebook where I've written down those 3 answers. And so I can look back at that, and I know as an organization we have that information, and it allows us to show that we at least listened and cared. And it might be that nothing ever comes of that, but it allows me, when we're thinking about trainings and topics and things we want to do, that I've got at least some data around what our employees care about. So there's just something to think about. With that, I do want to make sure that we're respectful of time. We are happy to stick around and answer more questions, but I also want to let anybody who needs to get out of here go. And also, if anybody wants to stick around for a tour, we're, of course, happy to do that. But thank you guys all for coming. We really appreciate it, and hopefully you got something out of it that you can bring back to your companies.
Thank you.
Thank you.